Hello, welcome. My name is Vanessa Torres. I'm the Program Manager of Interpretation, Education, and Community Engagement here at Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park. In honor of Hispanic Latinx Heritage Month, we here at Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to take some time to reflect on LBJ's influence and work with the Latino community. If you already know about LBJ, you know that he was a complex individual, a son of the Hill Country, a Democrat that battled between being progressive and balancing his agenda with the Southern Democrats. Despite his challenges, he was a huge supporter of civil rights and ensuring that all people had the same opportunities. Growing up in this place that I sit right now, Texas Hill Country, shaped his views on the environment, his work as a principal and teacher in Cotula, and his interactions with staff and the community shaped his views on civil rights. Now let's dive a little deeper to talk a little bit about LBJ's work. To help me do that, I have with me today Jorge Hernandez and David Vela. Jorge currently serves as the Park's Education and Community Engagement Coordinator. Prior to his work here, he served at Lincoln Home National Historical Site, San Antonio Missions National Historical Park, and Palo Alto Battlefield. David, also with us today, retired as Deputy Director, exercising the authority of the Director of the National Park Service. He retired in August of 2020 after a 30-year career with the National Park Service. Prior to assuming his last position, David worked at national park sites throughout the country, including Grand Teton National Park, where he served as the first Latino superintendent, Associate Director for Workforce Relevancy and Inclusion at headquarters in Washington, D.C., and many other locations, including serving here at Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park as superintendent. David started his career as a cooperative student at San Antonio Missions National Historic Park as well. So thank you both for your time today and for being here with us. Jorge, to help us kind of dive in a little more into the history, I want to pose the first question to you. How would you describe Lyndon B. Johnson's commitment and legislation to improve the lives of the Latinos in the United States?
Yes, I think I would describe his commitment to improve the lives of Latinos as a maybe personal battle, maybe as an unspoken promise, influenced by his personal experiences. When we can say that LBJ's first interaction with the Latino community, specifically with the Mexican American community, is when he was a teacher, principal and teacher in Cotula, Texas in the 1920s. It was during that experience that LBJ, in a way, experienced firsthand the social and economic conditions Mexican Americans were growing up. He experienced the segregation that existed not only in the town of Cotula, which is south of San Antonio, but also in the schools. The school that LBJ served, it was a segregated school. And this impact was so big that in 1965, when LBJ was standing in front of Congress, delivering a speech about the Voting Rights Act or Voting Rights Bill of 1965. He reflected on that initial experience with the Latino community, Mexican American community. And during that speech, he related that experience to a civil rights situation. And I'm going to read really quick the quote that LBJ said during that speech, because I think it's really important to understand how he felt about the Latino community, but then what he did in order to improve the lives of Latinos in the United States. So in 1965, LBJ said during that speech, "Somehow you never forget what poverty and hatred can do when you see its scars on the hopeful face of a young child. I never thought then in 1928 that I would be standing here in 1965. It never occurred to me in my fondest dreams that I might have the chance to help the sons and daughters of those students and to help people like them all over this country. But now I do have that chance, and I'll let you in on a secret. I mean to use it." those words by LBJ in a way summarizes his vision how to improve the lives of individuals in the United States through government action. He was given a speech not only to highlight the importance of passing the voting rights bill, but in a way talking about his campaign, his vision for America, which was known collectively as the Great Society, which included programs to better the lives of every single American, including Latinos. Within that program, you have social welfare programs such as, or in the lines of education, healthcare, job creation, and many others. Now, specifically, you also have programs such as Medicare that provided healthcare for millions of people in the United States, including Latinos, and this is still going on till this day. You also have food stamps that were able to combat malnutrition. You have programs such as Head Start, which is still going on today, which was designed to help children from underserved communities for success in public schools. So we can see the LBJ's commitment to the Latino community and Americans in general through this social programming. But more importantly, I think that what it's also important on LBJ's commitment was not only passing these legislations, but also how to involve the Latino community in passing these legislations, how to implement these policies. We're talking about federal grants and money that are supposed to go to the community, but how do you implement that? Well, LBJ and all of these programs in a way were sometimes controversial, there were pushbacks, but what's really interesting is how LBJ, the LBJ administration listened to the Latino community, the Mexican American community, and brought members of that community into the Great Society programming for them to implement those programs in their own communities. So for example, we have Latinos working in the Head Start program in leadership positions, more importantly, so they can bring those institutions or program into the Latino community themselves, because they're the ones on the ground listening to what their community demands. So I think what's really LBJ's commitment was not only passing this legislation, but listening to the demands of the people and adding the people or bringing the people together to implement these programs in the community that needed it the most. Head Start programs, for example, were implemented in many Mexican American neighborhoods throughout the nation. So I believe that's a good way to look at, LBJ's commitment to not only the Latino community within his Great Society program, but Americans in general.
Thank you, Jorge. And I just want to clarify for those folks who are watching with us right now that your emphasis on Mexican American communities doesn't define the whole Latino community, but that was at the time the population that was here in
Yes.
That he
Mexican Americans. Yeah, Mexican Americans were the second largest minority during that time.
So thank you for that. I just wanted to clarify that, we know in this discussion of Latinos, that's just one segment of that community, doesn't make up the whole Latino Hispanic community there. Thank you for that. So David, with Jorge talking about some of these Great Society programs, I know you have a personal connection to that. What was that significance of that history and that legislation for you?
Yeah, one of my most memorable experiences with Lady Bird Johnson was sharing exactly my thoughts on that. I conveyed to her that I was a product of the Great Society initiative, in that I was a graduate of Head Start. While my dad was attending the University of Michigan to get his master's degree in the 70s, we were on the food stamp program and benefited from other initiatives that the Great Society generated for all Americans, but also to Mexican Americans. Growing up in the 60s and 70s in Texas, we were very grateful and appreciative personally and intimately about his commitment to achieve those interests for the greater good of our nation. Jorge talked about his experiences, especially with the Mexican American community in Cotula. And there's a quote that I reflect upon that I think is very telling, because I think it was a harbinger and a drive, a motivation that helped him to further his interest in developing a great society. He said, few of them, referring to the students in Cotula, few of them could speak English. I couldn't speak much Spanish. The president said, the students were poor, hungry, and aware that people hated them, but they didn't know why. The president said, and he often wished that there was more that he could do for them. Well, history reflects that he did, not only for those students in Cotula, but Americans across the country, in Appalachia, that were poor and impoverished, to rural areas, urban areas. There's no question that that experience with our community was telling, lasting, and important to the nation.
Thank you, David. Jorge, you also have a strong connection to Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park, specifically the Texas White House. And, you know, as for folks who don't know, Lyndon B. Johnson had a strong connection and appreciation for cultures across the world. If the German chancellor was coming to the Texas White House, you know, he had a German band come and play. Him and Lady Bird both really appreciated and celebrated different cultures here in the Hill Country. But bringing it back to the Latino community, Jorge, can you tell me a little bit about your connection here?
Yes, so my connection with Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park is through a family member, my grandfather, Fructuoso Hernandez. He's from Tuxtla Gutierrez, Chiapas. This state is in southern Mexico, bordering Guatemala in Central America. And I'm not sure the exact reasons yet of why my grandpa left Chiapas, but later he arrived to Matamoros, Tamaulipas, in northern Mexico. That's where he settled. That's where he met my grandma, Maria Marroquin, and where my dad was born. Growing up in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, I heard all these wonderful stories of my grandpa when he played the marimba. And if you can picture a marimba, it's this huge instrument with wooden bars that look like a piano, and you hit those with a stick, like a drumstick, and at the end of the stick you have rubber. So when you play it, beautiful melodies come out of that thing. And my grandma hated it because it was this huge thing in the middle of the living room, and she just wanted to move it around every time. But so I grew up listening to all these stories of like the adventures and misadventures of my grandpa playing on both sides of the border in Matamoros, Brownsville, or sometimes in Laredo. And he played in that geographic region in the 1950s and 1960s. So in 1964, Mexico elects a new president, Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. And of course, LBJ being LBJ, he invited him over to the Texas White House for an informal work meeting. And that means barbecue and music. And just imagine that afternoon in November 14, I believe it was November 12, 1964, when Díaz Ordaz visited the LBJ ranch. And you can imagine, moving pieces around, people talking about politics. And in the background, you have this band called Ecos de Chiapas playing for the president of the United States and the newly elected president of Mexico. And in that band, it's my grandpa playing. And I remember growing up listening to the story when my grandpa played at the LBJ ranch. And for us was something like, oh, that's cool. My grandpa played for an American president and for a Mexican president. But we never gave it too much thought until 2021 that I started working here, and I reached out to my parents and my uncle in Mexico to let them know, guess where I'm working? I'm working at Lyndon B. Johnson, where my grandpa played in 1964. And for them was just wonderful experience. And they, out of nowhere, my uncle from Mexico started sending me photos of my grandpa playing on this site. And he sent me a photo of LBJ and Lady Bird Johnson signed by them. And on the photo, it said, "To the Marimba Echoes de Chiapas, with our warm appreciation and all best wishes, Lady Bird Johnson and Lyndon B. Johnson." And it was just a wonderful experience and personal connection for at this national park, which made me think, are we following the footsteps of our ancestors to get to places that we never thought we were going to be at, right? And then 3 weeks later, working here at LBJ, I realized, oh, wait, there's an actual exhibit photo of my grandpa at the LBJ ranch. So this personal connection with this national park, I think this is the type of stories that help us puts our stories in context of things that we think we have no connection at all, such as a national park, President of Mexico, President of the United States. So that's my personal connection with this national park.
Thank you, Jorge. That's such a cool connection story. So going back to the legislation, which we talked a lot about at the beginning of this conversation, David, what is, in your opinion, the most important legacy to the Latino community from LBJ?
There are a number of thoughts that come to mind, but I think going back to his roots at Cotula and what he experienced, hardship and pain and frustration and lack of hope in some cases, because of the living conditions that his students were enduring, literally coming off the fields right into the classrooms. Very little to play with. In fact, President would use his meager earnings to help, purchase supplies and materials, et cetera. And so I think that what he did on the poverty front was extremely important. That gave all Americans hope that they can succeed, because they had those basic necessities of life, roof over their heads, food to eat, clothing, employment. So his war on poverty and what he did, I think, was like a domino effect, that it helped to, once you went through that experience, you got your education, you had gainful employment, you were a contributing member of society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the dominoes started to fall once you rose above poverty. And I think that's his biggest legacy, and a legacy that frankly continues today. Many of those programs with various degrees of change are still serving us today.
And Jorge, how do we continue the work of President Johnson and Latino civil rights leaders to build a more just society?
I think we can start by recognizing the stories that put Latinos in the forefront in the making of the United States. During Hispanic Heritage Month, we reflect on the contributions of Latinos. And I think in the 1960s, you have Latino leaders such as Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, who were fighting for representation for civil rights, right? So I think by recognizing these stories and learning about these stories, we can continue that work. We can learn a lot of lessons from historical figures, and those lessons are really empowering. Sometimes we might find ourselves thinking, how can we keep up the work of these individuals, right? And if we look at their stories, they were ordinary individuals who looked at what issues were affecting their communities, and they organized and took up action in the political process. So I think those are some of the lessons that we can learn in order to continue the work that individuals like Lyndon B. Johnson and Latino leaders to push the bar forward to create a better society in the United States.
Well, thank you both. I think that concludes our formal kind of back and forth question and answer. But I wanted to, any closing thoughts or anything we didn't convey during this conversation?
No, Vanessa, again, thank you for the opportunity to participate. And I agree with Jorge. I think, we have a unique opportunity as the nation celebrates its founding, the 250th anniversary, as we did during the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, to tell the stories that haven't been told of our Latino community, their efforts, their ongoing struggles to create a more perfect union, whether it's the founding of our country or trying to keep our country together during the Civil War and current day. So I applaud you and what you're doing at the park and the National Park Service for their ongoing commitment to ensure that that happens, that these conversations continue to take place for the benefit not only of our own Latino community, Latinx community, but for the community at large. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you both again for your time today. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining our conversation today.